The rain had been falling on Boston for 3 days straight, not the soft kind of rain that makes the city look romantic from a distance. The hard kind, the kind that comes in sideways off the harbor and finds every gap in your coat and settles into your bones before you have time to decide whether to let it. It came down in sheets against the tall windows of the Carver Grand Hotel in Back Bay, turning the street lights below into long smears of gold and red, turning everything outside into something that looked almost beautiful, if you weren't paying close attention to how much it hurt to be standing here tonight. Nora Callahan was paying attention to everything. She was 32 years old, and she had learned over the past 14 months to pay attention to everything. To the way a room sounded when a particular song started playing, to the way her own hands behaved when she stopped watching them, to the exact location of every exit in every room she walked into, not because she planned to use them, but because knowing where they were was the only way she could make herself stay. She was sitting at table 11 in the Carver Grand's main ballroom, which her sister Sylvie had rented for the occasion of her wedding reception, and she was doing what she had trained herself to do over the past year and 2 months. She was surviving. Not thriving, not healing, not moving forward in the way the phrase was supposed to mean. Just surviving, breathing in and breathing out, and keeping her hands flat and still on the white tablecloth, because if she let them curl into fists, someone at this table would notice, and then there would be questions she wasn't prepared to answer with any version of the truth. The ballroom was full, 200 people, cream-colored roses on every table, something green and trailing that Nora couldn't name, chandeliers, throwing a soft gold light over everything that made people look slightly better than they were, slightly softer, slightly less marked by the ordinary damage of living. The guests were eating carved chicken and laughing at speeches and raising champagne glasses with the particular relief that comes from watching two people successfully commit to each other in a world where commitment has become a radical act. Nora had attended 11 weddings in the past 4 years. She had been a good guest at 10 of them. Tonight she was struggling. The 2 chairs beside her were empty. That was the thing she kept coming back to. The thing her eyes moved toward every few minutes without her permission. The chair on her left had been set aside for her father. Sylvie had arranged a small tribute, a framed photograph, and a single white carnation, the flower Martin Callahan had bought his wife every anniversary for 30 years, because white carnations were what he could afford when they were young. And he had never stopped buying them, even after it didn't matter financially anymore. Martin Callahan had died 14 months ago in a hospital in Gloucester, Massachusetts. A cardiac event so sudden and complete that none of them had made it there in time to say anything that mattered. He had been 61 years old. He had been a music teacher at a school in Marblehead for 3 decades. He had loved Bartok and bad weather and the smell of used bookshops and every person in his family with an intensity that made you feel when you were in his presence, like the most interesting version of yourself. He had played piano on Sunday mornings in the living room of the house in Marblehead with the particular patience of a man who believed that beauty was a practice, not an event. The chair on Nora's right was simply empty. Daniel had occupied that chair for 4 years. He had been present in her life for 4 years, in her apartment, in her bed, in the margins of manuscripts she brought home to translate in the form of coffee left on her desk when she stayed up too late. And then 6 months ago, she had returned from a 2-week translation residency in Prague to find an email in her inbox. Not a phone call, not a conversation, an email 47 words long. She had memorized every one of them without meaning to, the way you memorize the exact location of a wound. She picked up her champagne glass and took a long, careful drink and set it down. Across the room, Sylvie caught her eye from the head table. Sylvie was 28, 4 years younger, dark-haired, where Nora was, light, effortlessly social, where Nora needed to prepare for crowds the way athletes prepared for a competition. The expression on Sylvie's face right now was the one she had been wearing all evening whenever she looked at her older sister. The careful, apologetic watchfulness of someone who has done a wonderful thing that happens to hurt someone she loves. Nora gave her a small nod that meant she was fine. It was a complete lie, but it was the only nod she had available tonight. The band was a 6-piece jazz ensemble Sylvie and her new husband had brought in from New York. They had spent the first hour playing upbeat standards, the kind of music designed to move people onto the dance floor after their 3rd drink, and they had succeeded. The floor was crowded and warm and full of the easy joy of an evening that had gone exactly as planned. Then the bandleader leaned into his microphone and said something low that Nora didn't catch over the noise of the room. and they began to play the Bartok lullaby. It was not a famous piece, not something you would recognize from a film or hear on the radio. A quiet, unassuming Hungarian folk melody that Bela Bartok had arranged for piano in 1908, which most people in this ballroom could not have named if offered money to do it. Martin Callahan had played it on a battered upright Yamaha in the Marblehead living room every Sunday morning for as long as Nora could remember. He had played it at birthdays and graduations in every family occasion where music was possible. When Nora left for graduate school in New York, he had mailed her a cassette recording of it because she didn't own a record player. She had known it was on the playlist. She and Sylvie had discussed it months ago before everything with Daniel, before Nora had agreed to come tonight on the strength of a love for her sister that outweighed her own capacity for self-preservation. Knowing had not helped. The first 4 bars hit her somewhere behind the sternum, in the place where grief has no name and no language, and no translation available, no matter how many languages you carry. Her hands went flat against the tablecloth, her chest locked. The thing she had been carefully not feeling since she arrived at the hotel rose up through her body with the sudden, terrible efficiency of water finding a crack in stone. She did not cry. She pressed her thumbnail into her palm until the pressure gave her something physical to locate herself in. She breathed through her nose at a measured pace and looked at the middle distance above the dance floor. And she survived the Bartok lullaby the same way she had been surviving everything else for 14 months. But her hands were shaking when it ended. She stood up from this table without deciding to. She was moving toward the edge of the room, toward the quieter darkness near the tall windows, before she had made any conscious plan. She needed 30 seconds away from the noise. She needed to stand next to the rain on the glass and breathe and recalibrate and return to being the version of herself capable of making it through the rest of the evening without breaking down at her sister's wedding. She made it to the windows. She pressed one hand against the cold glass and leaned her forehead close without touching it and breathed. The rain slid down the outside of the pane in long silver threads. 5 stories below Boston moved through the wet night with the stubborn, unimpressed persistence the city applied to most things. Traffic crawling through Back Bay. A couple huddled under a single umbrella at the corner. A delivery truck parked illegally with its hazard lights blinking orange into the dark. The Bartok, a voice said beside her. Just that. 2 words. Quite enough that she almost missed them under the noise of the room. She turned fast because she hadn't heard anyone approach, which was unusual. Her spatial awareness was generally good and habit developed over years of navigating archive basements and conference rooms where something was always about to fall. The man standing a few feet away was tall and wore a dark suit with the ease of someone who had grown up in dark suits rather than learned to wear them as an adult. He was somewhere in his late 30s. Dark-haired, he had about him a quality of stillness she associated with the people who had spent a great deal of time in rooms where controlling their own visibility mattered. His eyes were dark. He was not looking at her with pity. That was the first thing she noticed, and it was immediately notable because pity had been the default expression directed at her from every quarter this evening. He wasn't smiling either. He was simply looking at her with a very calm attention. The way you look at something you are trying to understand rather than something you are trying to impress. I'm sorry, she said, because it was the first thing she could locate. Do I know you? No, he said. I was at the bar when they started playing it. I watched you. He paused. Not the way that sounds. How did it sound? Intrusive. He tilted his head slightly. I just meant I could tell what it cost you to sit through that. It seemed like the kind of music that belonged to someone specific. She turned back to the window. My father, she said, because there was something about the directness of his attention that made evasion feel more exhausting than honesty. He played it every Sunday. He died last year. I'm sorry, he said. Everyone is sorry. I mean it without expecting you to do anything with it, he said. That's the difference. That made her look at him again. Most people, when they offered condolences, wanted something back. They wanted to see the grief register to confirm their acknowledgement and had landed correctly to be released from the awkwardness of it. This man simply stood there as if he had said an ordinary thing and was content to let it sit without requiring her to manage his feelings about it. You weren't at the ceremony, she said, because she would have noticed him. No, I was occupied. I'm here for other reasons. He glanced back at the ballroom briefly. Your sister seems happy. She is. She's genuinely entirely happy. Nora pressed her thumbnail into her palm again without meaning to. I'm not doing a very good job of just being glad for that. You sat through a lullaby your dead father used to play at a celebration you had to attend alone. You're doing fine." The bluntness of it startled something loose in her chest. She almost laughed, which surprised her because laughing was not something she had expected to do tonight. It didn't quite make it out, but it came close. "You're very direct," she said. "I've been told it's a problem." "It isn't, not right now." His name was Roman. He offered it the way you offer something small and unremarkable without ceremony, without the follow-up question about what she did or where she was from that usually came attached to introductions at events like this. He simply told her his name and then stood beside her at the window for a moment in a silence that was to her considerable disorientation, not uncomfortable. The band moved into a second slow number. The dance floor shifted, couples pulling together with the practiced ease of people who knew how to occupy the same space. "Do you want to dance?" Roman asked. "No," she said. Most men, when told no at a wedding where the lighting was soft and the champagne had been flowing for 2 hours, would recalibrate and find a different approach or excuse themselves with something gracious and move toward better odds. Roman did neither. He simply turned back to the windows as if the no had been a complete and satisfactory answer, which it was, and he remained where he was. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I'm aware." He put one hand in his jacket pocket. "Are you going back to the table?" "In a minute." "Then I'll stand here for a minute," he said. "If that's all right." It was strange. That was the only word she had for it. The quality of his presence next to her at the window was not demanding anything from her. He wasn't filling the silence with reassurance or questions or the low-grade performance of concern. He was simply there the way a room is there, available, not pressing. She found herself talking, not about Daniel and not at length, but talking. She told him she was a translator, that she worked primarily in Hungarian and Czech literary fiction, that she had spent the better part of a decade building a practice around authors most American readers had never encountered. She told him her father had given her a copy of a Bartók biography when she was 14, and that it was the book that had led in the winding and indirect way that things lead to other things. To her obsession with Central European literature, which had led to languages, which had led to the career she now occupied in a small studio in Cambridge, with shelving she had built herself and a space heater that worked intermittently. Roman listened, not with the nodding performative listening of someone waiting for their opening. He listened with a quality of attention that felt almost uncomfortable in its completeness, the way certain silences feel heavier than sound. When the band finished its slow set and returned to something up-tempo, Nora realized she had been standing at the window for almost 30 minutes. The tight machinery in her chest had eased slightly, not gone, not resolved, just slightly unlocked from the position it had been locked in since the first note of the lullaby. "I should go back," she said. "Okay," he said. She turned away from the window and then turned back. "Thank you," she said, "for staying. You did the same thing he said. You just didn't know it was mutual." She went back to the table and sat down and looked at the empty chair on her right and the photograph of her father on her left and drank the rest of her champagne in one long, measured pull. Across the room, she could see Roman speaking quietly with one of the hotel staff, and then a door opened somewhere and he was gone, with the easy, complete disappearance of a man who knows precisely how to move through a space without leaving evidence. She thought about what he had said. You just didn't know it was mutual. She put it away in this place where she put things that didn't resolve cleanly. And she stayed for the rest of the evening and danced once with her brother-in-law's father, who was 73 and kind, and helped Sylvie bustle the bottom of her dress at 11 in the hotel bathroom, and held her sister's face in both hands and said with complete honesty that she was beautiful and loved, and that her husband was the right person. Sylvie cried. Nora didn't. And that was the night. She left at midnight, took a cab back across the river to Cambridge, and sat in her studio apartment in the dark for a while before going to bed, which she did not do immediately. She had left her coat in the coat check, and she only realized halfway undressed at 1 in the morning that she had also left a small cloth bag containing her grandmother's pearl earrings somewhere in the ballroom, the earrings her mother had given her to wear for the occasion. The ones that had belonged to her grandmother brought out of Budapest in 1956 in a coat pocket, which was the kind of object whose loss was not acceptable. She called the hotel. The night desk confirmed they had found a small cloth bag. She said she would come first thing in the morning. The Carver Grand looked different at 9 on a Sunday morning. The previous evening's grandeur had been efficiently disassembled. The flowers were gone, the ballroom doors closed. The gold light of the chandeliers replaced by the clean, flat brightness of daylight through high windows. The lobby had the quiet particular to large hotels in morning hours, that transitional stillness bristled between the noise of arrival and the noise of departure. Guests moved through with luggage and purposeful expressions. The front desk operated at reduced speed. The concierge at the main desk was a man in his mid-60s named Walter Ames, according to his name tag. White hair, the practiced calm of someone who had worked the front line of a luxury hotel long enough to have seen every conceivable human situation unfold on the marble in front of him. He had the bag ready. He handed it over without fuss, asked her to confirm the earrings were inside, which they were, and wished her a good morning. She should have left. She was turning for the door when she heard her name, not loudly, just precisely. Ms. Callahan. She turned. Roman was standing at the far end of the lobby near a corridor she hadn't noticed the night before. He was in a charcoal jacket without a tie, and in the morning light he looked less like a figure from the margins of a party and more like someone who was exactly where he belonged, which was a strange thing to project onto a person she had met once. But the lobby oriented itself around him slightly in the way spaces sometimes adjusted to the person who controlled them, and she filed that observation without quite knowing what to do with it. "You left your coat as well," he said. "Someone found it during cleanup." She looked at him. "How did you know it was mine?" "Walter described you." She glanced at Walter, who was doing an impressive impression of a man who had heard nothing. "That's oddly efficient," she said. "The hotel tries to be." He crossed the lobby toward her with the same unhurried quality she remembered from the night before, stopping at a distance that was polite but not cautious. "Good morning." "Good morning." She held up the cloth bag. "I got the earrings." "I know. Walter texted me." He paused. "I wanted to make sure you got them yourself. They seemed important." They had seemed important. They were pearl earrings in a cloth bag. He would have had no way of knowing they were important unless he had been paying a very particular kind of attention to the way she carried herself the night before, which implied a level of observation she wasn't sure how to file. "You work here," she said. "Last night you said you were here for other reasons, but you work here." "I look after the building," he said, which was technically an answer. "Manager." The pause before he responded was a full, deliberate half beat too long. "Something like that," he said. She noticed the pause. She cataloged it. She did not press it because she had not slept well, and she had her grandmother's earrings, and the morning light was making her feel slightly more capable of forward motion than she had felt at 1 in the morning in the dark of her studio. "I'm going to go," she said. "Yes," he said. "Thank you, again. Your coat is at the front desk. Walter will get it for you." She got her coat. She went out into Sunday morning. The rain had stopped, and Boston smelled like wet stone and coffee from the place on the corner, and all the things it smells like when it has decided to give you a temporary reprieve from its weather. She thought about that half-beat pause. She thought about the way the lobby had oriented itself. She tried not to think about either of these things with the intensity of someone who already knows the effort is going to be insufficient. She was halfway down the block when she stopped walking. Then she kept walking, but it was the stop that mattered. The 3 weeks after Sylvie's wedding were the quietest Nora had spent in months. She worked. She translated. She was midway through a novel by a Hungarian author named Csaba Ferenc, whose sentences were long, river-like things that required her to hold their entire structure in her mind before she could commit to a word choice in English. The work was absorbing enough to crowd out everything else for 6-8 hours at a time. This was why she had chosen the work originally, the way it filled her, the way it left no room for the less manageable material. She went to dinner with her mother once, to a lecture at MIT once, to the farmer's market on Saturday morning twice, which was a ritual she maintained not because she loved it, but because structure was something she had learned to manufacture in the absence of the organic kind. She did not think about Roman in any organized way. She thought about him the way you think about a song you have heard once, in fragments, in the wrong order. At unexpected moments, the flatness of his voice when he said things that were honest, the quality of his stillness at the window, the half-beat pause in the lobby when she asked what he was, and he gave her an answer that was true and incomplete simultaneously. She did not think she would see him again. Boston was large enough that accidental repetition was not statistically likely, and she had no reason to return to the Carver Grand, and he had given her no means of contact, which was its own kind of message. Then a Wednesday afternoon arrived 3 weeks and 2 days after the wedding, and she was at her work table in the Cambridge studio in the condition she was usually in at 3 in the afternoon. Coat off, First coffee abandoned, second coffee cold. Surrounded by reference books in 3 languages and the productive chaos that characterized her working process. When the buzzer at the street door sounded, she was not expecting anyone. She pressed the intercom. "Yes, Miss Callahan." The voice was recognizable immediately. The way her body registered it before her brain caught up was diagnostic information she did not enjoy having. "I have something for you," he said, "if you have a few minutes." She pressed the door release. She looked at herself in the small mirror beside her work table for exactly 2 seconds, which was the amount of time she allowed before deciding the verdict didn't matter. And then she opened the door to the landing. Roman was carrying a book, not a large book. A slim, cloth-covered volume, clearly old, clearly handled with care. He was holding it in both hands the way you hold something you are not entirely sure you have the right to deliver. She recognized the cover before she could read the title because she had seen images of it in academic catalogs for years. The pale blue cloth, the gold lettering, the small embossed bird in the lower left corner. "That's not possible," she said. "It's a 1929 first edition," he said. "Budapest printing, Margaret Lee's collected poems, the full volume." He extended it toward her. "I bought it at an auction in London 3 weeks ago," he said, before I was entirely sure why. She looked at the book, and then at him, and then at the book again. Her hands moved to take it before she had made a conscious decision to reach for it. The way your hands move towards certain things by reflex, by the deep pull of something you have wanted for a long time. "I wrote my doctoral thesis on her," she said. Her voice was doing something she didn't approve of, a slight unsteadiness at the edges. "I've been trying to find a first edition for 11 years. They only printed 400 copies. There are maybe 30 left in private hands." 26, he said, according to the auction house's research. She looked up at him. "How did you know to look for this?" "I read your work," he said. "After the wedding, I found your translation of the Ferencz collection. You wrote in the introduction that Lee was the reason you started translating, that she was the author who taught you what language could do when it was carrying grief." He paused. "It seemed like something you should have." The studio was quiet around them. The rain that had been threatening all morning was starting now against the windows, very soft. The kind of rain that doesn't insist on itself. She was holding the 1929 first edition of Margaret Lee's collected poems in both hands, and the man who had brought it to her was standing in her doorway with the same quality of attention she had first seen at the ballroom window, waiting for her to say something, not filling the space with justifications or expectations, simply waiting. But before she said anything, before she thought to offer coffee or clear a chair, she opened the book carefully to the first page, and she saw it. A handwritten inscription in the upper corner, faint with age but fully legible. A note written in English in a careful, slanted hand from the 1940s. She had never seen it referenced in any catalog description. She read it once silently and then read it again. "Some things cannot survive translation. They can only survive being carried." She stood very still for a long moment. She had written about this exact idea in the 3rd chapter of her dissertation. Not this sentence precisely, but this thought. The idea that certain works of literature were not translatable in any traditional sense, that the translator's real job was not to move meaning from one language to another, but to carry it across the distance without letting it break. She had spent 40 pages on that argument. It was the part of her doctoral work she was most proud of and had most rarely discussed in public, because it required explaining too much context, and most people did not want that much context. Roman had read her dissertation carefully enough to know that this inscription in this particular copy of this particular book would mean something to her that it would not mean to anyone else in the world. She looked up at him. He said nothing. He was watching her with the expression she had first seen at the ballroom window. Complete attention. Waiting without prompting. "Come in," she said. He came in. She cleared a chair and he sat. She made fresh coffee because the second coffee was completely cold. And because making coffee was something to do with her hands, while her brain tried to catch up with the fact that the book she was holding was real and had been found by a person she had met once at a wedding and who had read her work well enough to understand what it meant. They talked for 2 hours. Not about the hotel, not about the wedding or her father or Daniel's empty chair. They talked about Lee's poetry and the problem of translating rhyme in a language as grammatically rigid as Hungarian into the more elastic freedom of English. About whether a translator's job was to serve the author or the reader when those two loyalties were in conflict, which they always were, which was the central ethical tension of the entire profession. Roman was not a scholar. He did not pretend to be. He had read what he had found, and he had found more than she expected. He asked questions that were genuine and listened to the answers with an attentiveness that made her feel each time she finished speaking that what she had said had actually been received rather than merely heard. When the afternoon got dark around them, she realized the time and said so. He stood up and thanked her for the coffee and moved toward the door. "Roman," she said. He turned. Why, she said. Honestly, why this? He considered the question for a long moment. The rain was steady now against the windows. The studio was warm with lamplight and the smell of coffee and old paper. "I don't know how to explain it without sounding like something it isn't," he said finally. "So I'll just say that I've met a lot of people. I find very few of them interesting in the way that makes me want to understand what they're carrying." He looked at her steadily. "You're one of the few." She sat with that. He went to the door. "There's a reading," she said. "Thursday evening at the Brattle Bookshop. A Czech novelist I translated last year. It's not exciting, but the books are good and they usually have wine." He looked at her across the length of the studio. "Thursday," he said. 7, she said. She was doing the thing she had been doing since the night at the window. She knew that. The thing where she let the interesting stranger stay a little longer than it was strictly safe. She knew what that was, what machinery it set in motion, where those things had ended before. But the 1929 first edition of Margaret Lee's collected poems was in her hands, and she was already thinking about what she would say to him on Thursday evening, which meant she was already quietly and without quite deciding to beginning to want something she hadn't wanted in 6 months. That night, she put the Lee volume on the shelf above her desk, where she could see it from her work table. She stood there looking at it for a long time in the dark of the studio, long after the rain had stopped and the city had gone quiet outside. She didn't yet know what she had let in. She didn't yet know what he was hiding beneath the careful, ordinary surface of a man who looked after buildings and attended auctions in London and listened to women at windows in the way that nobody had listened to her in a very long time. She didn't yet know any of it. But the book was there, and the coffee was cold again, and somewhere across the river, the Carver Grand Hotel rose against the dark Boston sky with its gold lights and its marble floors and its doors that opened before anyone spoke. And at the top of it, in a corner office that looked out over the entire city he owned quietly and completely, Roman Voss was already thinking about Thursday. Thursday came in cold and clear, the last cold evening of what had been a cold spring, the sky above the Charles the color of old pewter from the river all the way to the harbor. The wind had teeth. The streets in Harvard Square were full of people moving fast with their chins tucked into their collars, everybody somewhere warmer to be. Nora got to the Brattle Bookshop at 6:45. She was wearing the dark green coat, and she had done something with her hair that she immediately regretted, because it looked like she had tried, which she had, which was the problem. She bought a glass of bad white wine from the folding table near the register and found a spot near the back wall between a floor-to-ceiling shelf of Eastern European fiction and a column wrapped in event flyers, which put her back against something solid and gave her a sightline to the door. At 7:02, Roman walked in. Dark overcoat. He scanned the room the way she had seen him survey the lobby quickly and without appearing to locating her in about 4 seconds. He came directly toward her without stopping to look at the books, which told her something. Either he wasn't a browser by nature or he already knew where everything was. She would only later understand the weight of the second possibility. "Sorry," he said, arriving beside her. "Traffic." "You're 2 minutes late," she said. "I know." He looked at the wine in her hand. "Is that good?" "Absolutely not." "Good." He took a glass from the table. The event coordinator tapped the microphone and called the room to attention. Pavel Horak was 63 years old and had the physical quality of a man who had spent 40 years sitting at desks in bad light, which he had. He read in Czech first and then in Nora's English translation, which was the protocol she had established with him. The Czech for anyone who could follow it, then her version for everyone else. Nora had heard her own translations read aloud many times. It was always strange, like hearing a recording of your own voice played back at a slight distortion. The words were hers, but the breath behind them was someone else's. She was watching the room, but she was aware of Roman beside her. The way you are aware of a sound that hasn't started yet. After the reading during the signing queue that formed around Pavel's table, Roman moved to the shelving beside them and pulled out a collection of essays, leafed through the first few pages, put it back. Then he picked up a Herta Müller novel she had briefly considered translating 3 years ago before a German translator she respected got the contract. "Did you read this one?" he asked. "I tried to buy the rights to it," she said. "Someone beat me to it. Was that a loss?" "Professionally, no. Personally." She looked at the cover. "It's a book about how the things governments take from you never stop being taken. It was a very important book for me to have wanted to translate and not gotten." He looked at her. "Because of your grandmother," he said. "Budapest, the earrings." She had mentioned the earrings at the studio obliquely in the context of Lee's poetry. He had been paying attention to the connections between things she said, which was not something most people did. "Yes," she said. He put the book back on the shelf with the care he put into everything physical. "Have you eaten?" She hadn't. They went to a small Portuguese place 2 blocks away in Somerville that was loud and bright and cheap, which she had chosen over the alternatives because she was not ready for anywhere that required navigating the emotional territory of candlelight. They sat across a small table from each other and talked, and already the pattern of it was distinct from any conversation she had had in recent memory. There was no performance to it. He didn't angle the conversation toward himself. He asked about her work with the attention of someone who had done reading, and when she turned questions back toward him, he answered plainly without inflating or concealing. She asked what he actually did at the hotel. "Manage," he said. "That's not specific." "No," he said. "Are you going to be specific?" He looked at his plate. Something moved across his face. Not evasion exactly, more like a door that was unlocked but hadn't been opened yet. "It's a longer answer than I can give in a restaurant," he said. "Okay." She said it and meant it. She understood in a way that felt both true and potentially dangerous what he was doing. She had done the same thing herself, held information back not to deceive, but to protect a version of a situation that was still working. "All right," he said. "I'll tell you soon. I'll tell you everything." She believed him. That was information too. They walked back toward the square afterward in the cold, and he put her in a cab at 10:15. She rode home across the river and sat in her studio and opened the Lee collection to a poem she had been thinking about since the afternoon he brought it. A short one about a woman watching snow from a window in December, waiting for something she doesn't have a name for. She read it in Hungarian 3 times and then wrote a translation draft in English that was rougher and more direct than her usual process, less careful, less considered. When she read it back, she thought it was the best translation she had done in 3 years. She put that down to the Lee, not to anything else. Over the next 6 weeks, they built something. She would not have used that word during those weeks because the word implied intention, and she was carefully maintaining the position that what was happening was organic, ungoverned, not something she was choosing toward. But that was a lie she was telling herself with diminishing conviction. They walked the Esplanade on Sunday mornings. They attended a chamber concert at Jordan Hall, where the program included, without either of them arranging it, a Bartók string quartet. She watched Roman during the third movement, and his expression was the expression of a person for whom music was not background, but foreground. Not ambient, but structural. She thought about his father and the hotel and the things he hadn't told her yet, and she didn't ask. He came to the studio twice more. The second time he brought food from the Portuguese place in Somerville, and they ate at her work table with manuscripts pushed to one side. He read the opening page of her current translation project while she cleaned up. And when she came back, he had a question about her word choice for a construction in the third paragraph that was so precisely the right question that she stood still in the middle of the room for a moment, processing the fact that he had found it. She kissed him that night, not dramatically. She was standing beside the work table and he was putting the manuscript page down, and there was a moment of stillness that had been accumulating for 6 weeks, and she moved through it without planning to. His hand came up to the side of her face, very steady, the way he did everything. She thought with the part of her brain that was still operating analytically that this was the threshold, and she crossed it. He stayed until midnight. Then he left because she asked him to. Not because she didn't want him there, but because she needed to sit alone inside what had just shifted and understand it before she slept. He understood this without requiring explanation. He simply said goodnight and went. She sat at her work table in the lamplight for an hour. Then she went to bed and slept better than she had in 8 months. The gossip column ran on a Tuesday morning. She found it because Naomi, her friend who worked in publishing and tracked literary and cultural social media, the way some people track weather systems, texted her a link at 8:47 with the message, "Is this you?" followed by two question marks and a face that communicated something between alarm and excitement. The piece was on a social page she didn't follow, one of those city-specific outlets that covered the overlap between Boston's financial world and its social scene. The charity galas and board appointments in restaurant openings where money performed its willingness to be publicly visible. The headline read, "Hospitality heir Roman Voss spotted with mystery woman. Trouble for the Ashton Alliance." There was a photo. It had been taken from a distance through the window of the restaurant in Somerville. Slightly blurred by the glass, but clear enough. Two people at a small table. Her face was angled away, but her green coat was identifiable. Her hair was identifiable. The article identified Roman Voss as the youngest president in the history of Voss International, a luxury hotel and hospitality group with properties on 4 continents. It mentioned the Carver Grand. It mentioned several other properties by name. It mentioned that the Voss board had for several years been in discussions regarding a strategic partnership with the Ashton family, Old Boston Money in real estate and finance, and that the partnership was expected to be formalized in part through a union between Roman Voss and Everly Ashton, 29, whose photograph appeared in a small inset in the upper right corner of the piece. Nora read the article 3 times. Then she put her phone face down on the work table and sat very still with her hands in her lap and breathed. Something was happening in her chest that she recognized from before. The same locking mechanism. The same cold settling that had started in her sternum the night she opened a 47-word email from a man she had loved for 4 years. Only this time it was faster. Because she had apparently learned nothing. Or she had learned the wrong things. Or she had a talent for handing herself over to people who were operating in realities she didn't have full information about. She picked up her phone. She called him. He answered on the second ring. "Nora, don't," he said. She kept her voice even. She was working to keep it that way. "I want to ask you one question," she said, "and I want you to answer it before you explain anything." "Okay." Silence. "Okay. Is that article accurate?" The pause was 4 seconds. She counted them. "Largely," he said. She closed her eyes. "How largely?" "The valuation is slightly overstated. The rest of it," another pause shorter, "the rest of it is accurate." She stood up from the table. She walked to the window. The street below was doing its Tuesday morning thing, entirely indifferent to the fact that something had just broken cleanly in half in the room above it. "Voss International," she said. "You're the president." "Yes." "The Carver Grand isn't a hotel you manage. It's a hotel you own. My family owns it. I run the company, which means every other property in that article." "Yes," he said. "All of it." She pressed her forehead against the glass the same way she had at the ballroom window 6 weeks ago. Except this time the thing she was trying to keep in was not grief, but something sharper. Something with more anger in it than she was used to feeling cleanly. "Everly Ashton," she said. He didn't answer immediately, which was its own kind of answer. "There's a business arrangement the board has been pushing for 2 years," he said. "A merger. The Ashton family holds significant financing structures that are..." He stopped. "It's complicated." "Is it?" Her voice had gone flat. The flatness that happened when she was controlling something that would otherwise not be controlled. "The board wants it. My mother wants it. I've been managing it, delaying it." He exhaled. "Because of me. Partly mostly because I don't want it with or without you." A pause. "But yes, partly because of you." She turned away from the window. The Lee volume was on the shelf above her desk. Pale blue cloth, gold lettering. "You let me sit across from you at that table for 6 weeks," she said. "You sat in this room, you ate in this room, you listened to me talk about my father and my grandmother's earrings, and 11 years of trying to find a first edition that you bought at an auction 3 weeks after meeting me. And you didn't tell me." "No," he said. "I didn't tell you." "Why?" She could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. That was new? Hearing him not in control of something as basic as his breath. "Because I wanted one thing," he said. "One thing in my life that didn't start with what I am. Every person I meet knows what I am before they know anything else. Every conversation starts there. Every relationship is built on top of it." His voice was steady, but barely. "You sat at a window and talked to me for 30 minutes because I stayed when you expected me to leave. That was the first time in years that happened." The silence stretched. She felt it pulling at her from both ends. The pull toward him, which was real and which she hated having to admit was real. And the pull toward the door, toward the familiar posture of someone who had been here before and knew exactly how this kind of mistake compounded. I need time, she said. Okay. I don't mean a few hours. I know. I don't know how long. Nora, he said, and the way he said her name had something in it she couldn't afford to sit with right now. Take what you need. She hung up. She stood in the middle of the studio for a long time. The space heater clicked on. The building made the noises old buildings make. Settling sounds, pipe sounds, the particular creak of the third stair from the top that she had heard every day for 4 years. She picked up the Lee collection. She turned it over in her hands. The cloth was worn at the corners. The pages were foxed with age, some of them fragile at the edges. The binding had been repaired once carefully by someone who knew what they were doing. She opened it to the December poem and sat alone with what had shifted. She read it in Hungarian once. Then she put it back on the shelf and got her coat and went out because the studio had gotten too small for what she was feeling in it. She walked along the river for 2 hours in the cold. She thought about every conversation and every silence and the half-beat pause on Sunday morning in the hotel lobby when she had asked him what he was, and he had said something like that, which was the oldest evasion available, and which she had accepted because she had wanted to. She thought about her father, about the way he used to say that the worst lies were the ones you told to protect someone from something they had the right to know. She thought about the 47-word email. She thought about the empty chair. She was not going to make the same shape of mistake twice. She was absolutely certain of that. What she was less certain of was whether this was the same shape because the man at the other end of this situation was not Daniel. And the thing she felt standing beside the Charles River in the cold afternoon was not the same thing she had felt coming home from Prague to an inbox. And the complexity of that difference was the problem she was walking along the river trying to solve. She didn't solve it that afternoon. She came home. She made tea. She didn't call him. That night at 11:15, her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. This is Harriet Voss. I understand if you don't wish to respond. I would like to meet with you if you are willing. I'll come to wherever is convenient. Nora stared at the message for a full minute. She thought about not responding. She thought about blocking the number. She thought about the ways in which a woman who could find her personal cell phone number inside 12 hours of a gossip column appearing online was not a woman she was equipped to refuse without understanding what she wanted. She typed tomorrow, 10 o'clock, my studio. She pressed send before she could change her mind. Then she sat on her bed in the dark and looked at the ceiling and felt the shape of what was coming toward her with the dread of someone who has been in the path of something inevitable long enough to know that running hasn't worked yet and stopping might be worse. And the only remaining option is to stand still and let it arrive and find out what it costs. Harriet Voss arrived at 9:58. Nora heard the car before she saw it, a quiet, unhurried sound on the Cambridge street below, the kind of vehicle that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. She was at the window with her second coffee when a woman in a charcoal wool coat stepped out onto the sidewalk and looked up at the building with the calm, assessing gaze of someone who had already decided what she thought of it. Harriet Voss was 65 years old, and she moved like a woman who had spent 4 decades making rooms accommodate her rather than the other way around. Not aggressively, simply with the settled certainty of someone who had never had occasion to doubt her own right to occupy space. Her hair was silver and cut close. Her posture was the posture of someone who had been told to stand straight at a young age and had found over time that it was simply more efficient. Nora buzzed her up without using the intercom. When she opened the door, Harriet was already on the landing, coat still on, taking in the studio with the unhurried inventory she had applied to the building's exterior. The shelving Nora had built herself. The reference books in 3 languages, arranged by subject along the east wall. The work table with its organized disorder of manuscript pages and color-coded notes. The Lee volume on the shelf above the desk. She looked at the Lee volume for 1 second longer than everything else. Nora noticed. Please sit down, Nora said. Harriet sat. She did not remove her coat, which was information. She was not planning to stay long. She placed her bag on the floor beside the chair, with the deliberate tidiness of someone accustomed to not leaving things where they could be used against her. I won't take much of your time, Harriet said. Her voice was direct and low and had in it the faint residue of an accent Nora couldn't immediately place. Something Northern European worn smooth by decades of American living. I appreciate that, Nora said. She sat across from her and did not offer coffee because offering coffee would have made this a social call, and it wasn't. Harriet looked at her steadily. Not unkindly, but without softness. I came to understand what my son has done, she said, and whether you intend to do anything about it. What he's done, Nora said. He withheld information from you that you had a right to have. Harriet said it without inflection, as a fact rather than a judgment. That is what he did. I'm not here to defend it. Then why are you here? Because the people in Roman's life who have had full information about who he is have consistently wanted something from him that has nothing to do with who he actually is. She paused. And the person who didn't have full information appears to be the first one in some years who found him worth staying beside. She looked at her hands briefly, then back at Nora. I wanted to see who that was. Nora held her gaze. And Harriet looked at the Lee volume again, then back at Nora. You translated the introduction to the Farron's collection, she said. Roman gave me a copy 3 weeks ago. You wrote that the translator's first obligation is not to the text and not to the reader, but to the silence between the two. That what gets lost in translation is never the words. It's the weight behind them. She paused. I grew up in Warsaw, she said. I left when I was 19. There are things from that time I have never found the right words for in English. I read your introduction and thought that you had found words for the space where my words should be. She said it without sentiment, as a piece of observed fact. That is a rare thing. Nora was quiet for a moment. Roman read my dissertation, she said. I know, Harriet said. He read everything you've published. In the 2 weeks between the wedding and the auction in London. Nora thought about the inscription in the Lee volume, about the precision of that choice. What do you want from me? She asked. Directly. Harriet looked at her for a long moment. I want to know if you're someone who makes decisions from what she understands or from what she feels, she said. Because the situation my son is in right now is going to require both, and not everyone is capable of holding them at the same time. What situation? Harriet stood up. She picked up her bag from the floor. That's his to tell you, she said. Not mine. She moved toward the door and then stopped one hand on the frame and looked back at Nora with an expression that had something in it Nora hadn't expected. Something older and more worn than the composed surface she had brought into the room. Love is not the same as leverage, Miss Callahan, she said quietly. Make sure you know which one you are holding. Then she left. Nora sat in the studio for a long time after the sound of the car faded. She picked up the Lee volume. She read the inscription again. She put it back on the shelf. She did not call Roman that day, or the next. She translated for 6 hours each day and went to the farmer's market and answered emails from her publisher about the introduction deadline and lay awake at 1 in the morning, turning Harriet's last sentence over in her mind like a stone she couldn't set down. Make sure you know which one you're holding. She had been asking herself the same question in different language since she walked along the river. She still didn't have a clean answer. What she had was the knowledge that the question itself meant something, that a woman who didn't know her had driven to Cambridge and sat in her studio and said that sentence and meant it as something other than a warning. She thought it might have been an answer to a different question entirely. On the morning of the 12th day after the gossip column, a Sunday, her phone rang at 6:47. It was Naomi, which was unusual enough at that hour that Nora answered it before she was fully awake, sitting up in the dark of her bedroom with her hair in her face and the phone pressed to her ear. It's out, Naomi said. The Voss piece. It's on the magazine site and it's already being picked up. Nora, they named you. She was awake now, completely. Immediately awake with the cold clarity that arrives when something long expected finally lands. How much, she said. The whole thing. Your name, your work, the bookshop, the restaurant photo, your studio address. A pause. They got someone inside the board. There are meeting transcripts in the piece. Nora, someone gave her the actual transcripts. She was already out of bed, already moving to the laptop on the work table. She found the piece in 30 seconds because it was at the top of every search, the algorithm having already done its efficient, indifferent work. The article was spreading through financial and social media simultaneously with the velocity of a story that had multiple hooks for multiple audiences. She read it standing up, one hand braced on the work table. Patricia Cole had been thorough. The piece ran to 4,000 words and was structured like a legal brief. Evidence first, context second. Conclusion arrived at through accumulation rather than assertion. It documented Roman's 8 weeks of financial restructuring with the attention of someone who had access to internal documents. It quoted 2 board members anonymously. It included a timeline of his absences from key Ashton negotiation sessions, cross-referenced with dates the piece did not explicitly describe, but which Nora could map internally against their own. And then it named her. Not cruelly. That was the part she hadn't expected. Patricia Cole was not running a takedown. She was running a story, and the story required a person to be the axis of it, and Nora was the person. The piece described her accurately. Literary translator, Hungarian and Czech specialization, Cambridge-based, one well-regarded novel translation, and 2 essay collections. It situated her in the narrative as the private variable the Voss board had not accounted for when they mapped their merger timeline. The phrasing was neutral. The effect was not. She called Roman. He answered on the first ring, which meant he had been awake already or had not slept, and his voice had the particular flatness of someone who has been reading the same thing she had just read and has had slightly longer to arrive at whatever was on the other side of it. I know, he said. Someone gave Cole the transcripts, Nora said. Yes. From inside the board. Yes. A pause. I have 3 guesses, and 2 of them are the same person. Who? I need to make some calls first. Can you come to the hotel? When? Now, as soon as you can. She looked at the laptop, at her name in the 4th paragraph of a 4,000-word article that was currently being shared by financial industry accounts and climbing. She looked at the studio, the manuscripts, the shelving, the Lee volume on the shelf above her desk. Give me 20 minutes, she said. The Carver Grand on a Sunday morning in late May was quieter than it had been the last time she arrived at an unusual hour, but the quality of the quiet was different now. The lobby staff moved with the precise, contained energy of people who had been briefed. Walter Ames was at the concierge desk, rather than any of the junior staff, which told her the hotel had entered a mode she didn't have a name for but recognized as deliberate. Walter looked at her when she came through the door. He was 64 years old and had the face of someone who had seen the hotel through a death in a succession in 14 years of a man running an empire on insufficient sleep. His expression contained something she read as worry that had been converted into composure through long practice. Ms. Callahan, he said. He is on 32. I'll take you up. I know the floor, she said. Yes, he came around the desk anyway. I'll take you up. The elevator was mirrored, and she looked at herself briefly and then looked at the floor. She was in yesterday's dark green coat over a pullover she had grabbed in the dark. Her hair not done, no coffee in her system. She looked like herself. She looked nothing like a woman who belonged in a 32nd floor office of a luxury hotel empire. She looked exactly like a literary translator from Cambridge who had walked into something she hadn't fully measured. She looked like someone who was staying anyway. Walter brought her to the office door and knocked twice and opened it without waiting. The office was large and faced east, and the morning light was coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows at a low angle, hitting the surface of the desk and the papers on it and the 2 men standing beside it in a way that made everything look more exposed than it was. Roman was in a white shirt without a jacket, no tie, which she had never seen on him before, and it changed the geometry of him slightly, made him look younger and more tired simultaneously. The second man was someone she didn't recognize. 50s, compact, with the alert stillness of a lawyer or a fixer. This is Marcus Holt, Roman said. He has been our legal counsel for 9 years. Holt nodded at her without the social inflation of a smile. She respected that immediately. Do you know who gave Cole the transcripts, she said, because she had not come here at 7:15 on a Sunday morning to be briefed slowly. Roman looked at Holt. We believe so, Holt said. Who? A beat. Gerald Stowen, Roman said. He has been on the board for 11 years. He has also been receiving a consulting fee from the Ashton family's investment arm for the past 8 months. The room absorbed that. He has been on both sides, she said. Yes, Roman's jaw was set. He had access to every session transcript because he runs the governance committee. He has been feeding Cole information for at least 6 weeks, possibly longer. She thought about the article appearing this morning. She thought about the board meeting on Friday. 3 days. He wanted to force the vote, she said. He wanted to make the restructuring public before I could complete it, Roman said. Once it's in the press that I have been weakening the Ashton dependency, the board members who are undecided will read that as instability. As me acting unilaterally, the narrative becomes the president is destabilizing the company for personal reasons, which is what they'll vote on Friday. Yes, she looked at him across the desk. Can you prove the consulting fee? We are working on it, Holt said. Can you prove it by Friday? Holt said, possibly. That's not enough, Nora said. No, Roman said. It isn't. She walked to the windows. The city was spread out below in the morning light, all the rooftops and water towers, and the river and Cambridge beyond it. She had lived in this city for 9 years, and it had never looked like this to her, which was information about what standing 32 floors up in someone else's world did to your perspective. If you go into Friday's meeting without the proof, she said, what happens? They vote on the Ashton proposal. 7-4 in favor, probably, maybe 6-5. And if they vote to formalize, then I am bound by the board resolution to pursue the merger. And if I refuse, we go into a governance dispute that takes 8 months and costs the company $40 million in legal fees and market confidence. I probably win it eventually, but the company is damaged significantly in the interim. She turned from the window. And the third option, he looked at her steadily. I resign before Friday's meeting. I appoint an interim president. The restructuring I have already completed holds because it is legally executed. The board can vote on the Ashton deal, but without my signature, the formalization takes longer. Stowain loses his play, but I lose the company. The silence was total. She looked at Marcus Holt, who was looking at the surface of the desk with the expression of a man who had presented this option once already today and was not going to be the one to present it again. She looked at Roman. He was watching her with the quality of someone who has already made a decision and is waiting to find out if the person in the room with him is going to say the thing that makes it possible or the thing that makes it impossible. She didn't say either thing yet. Where is your mother, she said. On her way, he said. She called at 6. She had already seen the piece. Does she know about Stowain? She'll know in about 10 minutes. As if the sentence itself had been a cue, the office door opened. Harriet Voss came into the room with the coat she had worn to Cambridge still on, and the composure she had worn with it largely intact. But Nora had sat across from this woman for 45 minutes 3 days ago, and she knew now what to look for in the margins. And in the margins, Harriet was something she hadn't been in the Cambridge studio. She was frightened. It was contained and managed and almost invisible. But it was there in the way she took the room in the way her eyes moved to Roman first and then to Nora and then to Holt. Gerald Stowain, she said, addressing her son. Yes, Roman said. Since when? 8 months, possibly longer. Something happened in Harriet's face, something older and rarer than anything Nora had seen from her. An expression that had been waiting behind the composed surface for longer than today. He was at the table when your father died, she said. He gave the eulogy. Nobody said anything. Harriet crossed the room and stood at the desk and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at the papers there for a moment. Roman did not react immediately to what his mother had said. That absence of immediate reaction was itself the reaction. Nora watched him absorb it and understood that this particular piece of the information was going to cost him something separate from and more personal than everything else in the room. Then Harriet looked at her son. What do you need, she said. I need the Ashton family's internal documentation, Roman said. Their communications about the consulting arrangement with Stowain. If they authorize the payment, and it can be shown they were using a board member to manipulate the vote, the merger proposal is void. The board cannot proceed with a vote that was corrupted. How do you get that by Friday? We don't, Holt said from the corner. Not through legal channels. Their documentation is protected. Discovery in a legal dispute would take months. Harriet looked at Holt. But there are other channels. Mrs. Voss, don't manage me, she said. Quiet, precise. The same tone she had used to correct her own word choice in Cambridge. Are there other channels or not? Holt looked at his hands. There is a former Ashton family office employee who left under contentious circumstances 8 months ago, approximately when the Stowain arrangement appears to have begun. She has retained her own legal counsel in a wrongful termination dispute. He paused. If she had documentation and chose to share it, that would be a different conversation than discovery. Then have that conversation, Harriet said. It requires someone she will speak to. She will not speak to the company's legal team directly. There is significant distrust. I'll go, Nora said. Every head in the room turned toward her. She hadn't planned to say it. It had arrived the way the best translations arrived from somewhere below the level of planning, from the part of her that processed things at a different speed than her conscious mind. She doesn't know me, Nora said. I have no connection to Voss International. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a party to any of the disputes. She looked at Holt. If she is protecting herself from the company, she might talk to someone who isn't the company. Holt looked at Roman. Roman was looking at her with an expression she had seen in the Cambridge studio when she had said, "Tell me what you need." the expression of someone recalibrating in real time. You don't have to do this, he said. I know, she said. Nora. She kept her voice even. Do you want the company or not? A pause. Not at the cost of... She cut through it quietly. I'm asking you a direct question. Do you want the company? He held her gaze. Yes. Then let me go talk to someone. She looked at Holt. What is her name? Delia Marsh, Holt said. She is in Brooklyn. I have her address from the legal filing. Call her first, Nora said. Don't send me cold. Tell her a private individual, no company affiliation wants 30 minutes of her time about the Ashton family office. She picked up her coat from where she had laid it over the chair. Tell her I'm a translator. Tell her I don't work for anyone in this room. Holt looked at Harriet. Harriet looked at her son. Roman was looking at Nora with something that had moved past the controlled attention she had seen at windows and work tables. Something less managed and more direct and considerably more costly to look at directly. All right, he said. She went to the door. Nora, he said. She turned. He said nothing for a moment. He was standing in the low morning light of the east-facing office in his white shirt and no jacket, and what he was trying to say was visible in the space between them, even without words. I know, she said. She went out. Holt called Delia Marsh from the car on the way to Brooklyn, speaking in the careful, circumspect language of someone who had learned to say things without saying them. Nora sat in the back seat and looked out the window at the Sunday morning streets and breathed. She went through what she knew. She went through what she needed. She did the things she did before a difficult translation. Stripped the problem down to its essential structure and held it there without the noise of everything surrounding it. A woman who had left a powerful family's employ under bad circumstances. A wrongful termination dispute. 8 months of whatever had happened in that office coinciding exactly with a board member of a rival company going on an undisclosed payroll. Delia Marsh either knew what was in those communications or she didn't. If she didn't, the conversation was 30 minutes and then back to square one. If she did, the question was whether she would be willing to hand it to a stranger in a dark green coat who showed up on a Sunday morning with no credentials and no leverage and only the logic of the situation to offer. Holt got off the phone. She'll see you, he said. 15 minutes. Nora nodded. I'll wait in the car, he said. Yes, she said. Delia Marsh lived on a residential street in Brooklyn in a 2-story house with a small front garden just beginning to show green at the edges of its late spring bare state. She opened the door before Nora knocked, which meant she had been watching from somewhere inside, which was information about her state of alertness. She was 47, brown-haired, with the look of someone who had been operating under sustained stress for long enough that it had become their baseline. She was in weekend clothes, jeans, and a gray pullover, and she was holding a mug of coffee in both hands, the way you hold something you need to have between yourself and whatever is approaching. She looked at Nora for a long moment. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Someone with a briefcase. She stepped back from the door. Come in. The inside of the house had the stripped-back tidiness of a space that had been recently rationalized. Things in their place not from habit, but from a recent decision to put things in order. They sat in the kitchen at a small table. Delia put her mug down and looked at Nora across it. Who sent you, she said. Nobody sent me, Nora said. That's accurate and not a deflection. I'm here because the situation is moving faster than the people who have lawyers can move, and I don't have a lawyer. What are you? I'm a translator. Literary. Hungarian and Czech. She paused. I'm also someone who has been in Roman Voss's life for about 8 weeks, which is the personal reason I'm sitting in your kitchen rather than one of his legal team. Delia Marsh looked at her. Something in her expression shifted, not opening exactly, but acknowledging. You're the one in the article. I'm the one in the article. A pause. That must have been unpleasant. Yes, Nora said. It was. Delia turned her mug in her hands, looked at the table, looked at the window. The kitchen was quiet. Outside somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at something and then stopping. What do you know about Gerald Stone, Delia said. That he has been receiving a consulting fee from the Ashton family office for 8 months, Nora said. That he had access to Voss board transcripts and we believe he used them. That the fee started approximately when you left your position. She looked at Delia directly. I don't think that's a coincidence. Delia was very still. The reason I left, she said, and then she stopped. You don't have to tell me, Nora said. But if you have documentation of the arrangement with Stowain and you're willing to let it be seen by someone who can use it before Friday, then what I'm here to offer you is, she paused because she needed to be precise. This was the translation problem she had been working on in the car. What I can offer you is that the person who sees it is not the Voss company. It's me. And what I do with it is up to you to specify. Delia looked at her for a long time. The dog down the street stopped barking. I have emails, Delia said quietly, from the Ashton family office director authorizing the Stowain payment. I have them because I was the one who processed the payment before I understood what it was for. And when I understood what it was for, I made copies before I left. She looked at her mug. Because I knew one day someone was going to need them. Nora breathed. Will you let me see them, she said. Delia stood up. She went to a drawer at the far end of the kitchen counter. She stood there for a moment with her back to Nora, her hand on the drawer handle. Nora could see the decision moving through her body, the tightening and then the release of it. She opened the drawer. She took out a manila folder. She came back to the table and set it down in front of Nora and sat down and put both hands around her mug again. I want it on record that I came forward voluntarily, she said. I want that in writing from someone. That's all I need. I'll write it right now, Nora said. In your kitchen, whatever language you need. She borrowed a pen from beside the phone on the counter, and she wrote it on the back of an envelope she found in her coat pocket, dated it, signed it, and pushed it across the table. Delia read it and folded it and put it in the pocket of her pullover. Then Nora opened the folder. The emails were printed on plain paper in a small font, 15 pages. She read them at the kitchen table with the Sunday morning light coming through the window, and Delia Marsh sitting across from her with her coffee and her stillness. By the 5th page, Nora understood that what she was holding was not just the documentation of a corrupt payment. It was the documentation of a deliberate, coordinated strategy. The Ashton family had been operating inside the Voss board for 8 months with Stowain as their instrument shaping votes, managing information flow, positioning the merger as the only viable path, precisely because they had been quietly ensuring that every other path looked problematic. They hadn't just paid a board member. They had built a controlled environment in which the merger's approval was the only logical outcome, and they had done it while simultaneously maintaining the public appearance of an arm's-length negotiation between two independent parties. And then on page 11, she found it. An email chain between the Ashton family office director and their communications firm dated 3 weeks ago. The article that had named her, that had put her address and her work and her photograph into the public record, had not been an exposure. It had been a weapon. Patricia Cole had been given the story to force a Friday vote before Roman's restructuring was complete. The article naming Nora was not collateral damage. It was the mechanism. She closed the folder. She looked at Delia Marsh. You knew all of this, she said. I knew some of it, Delia said. I have been figuring out the rest for 8 months. Why didn't you go to the press? Delia looked at her steadily. Because I wasn't sure anyone would believe me without the right person holding the folder, she said. I've been waiting for the right person. Nora picked up the folder. She stood up from the table. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Delia said. Just make sure it counts for something. She went back to the car. Holt looked at her face when she got in and then looked at the folder and did not ask a single unnecessary question, which confirmed her assessment of him as someone who understood how to operate in close proximity to things that mattered. Drive, she said. He drove. She called Roman from the car. He answered before the first ring had finished. I have the email, she said when he answered. 15 pages. It's not just Stowain. The Ashton family built the whole thing from inside. She paused. They ran Cole. The article was theirs. The silence on the other end lasted 3 full seconds. Say that again, he said. The article was theirs, she said. Cole was fed the story to force Friday's vote before your restructuring was complete. She kept her voice even. They have been running an operation inside your board for 8 months, and there is documentation that proves it. Another silence, then Nora. She said, don't do the thing where you say, I shouldn't have gone. We can do that later. A breath. Are you all right? I'm fine. I'm in the car. I'm coming back. She looked out the window at Brooklyn moving past in the Sunday light. Roman. The board members who were undecided. The ones Stowain was managing. When they find out they were being managed. What happens to their vote? It changes, he said, and his voice had shifted into something she hadn't heard in it before. Something less tired and more precise. It changes completely. Then we have until Friday, she said. Yes, and you have what you need. A pause. Yes. She sat back in the seat. Her hands were steady in her lap, which surprised her because the morning had been the kind of morning that should have produced shaking hands. The folder was beside her on the seat. The city was moving past the windows in the low spring light of a Sunday that had started at 6:47, with a phone call and had become something she didn't have the right word for yet. She would find the right word later. That was what she did. She found the right words for things that had seemed untranslatable. What she knew right now was that she had walked into a kitchen in Brooklyn and sat across from a woman who had been waiting 8 months for someone to arrive and take the folder. And she had been that person, which was not something she had planned to be when she went to a wedding in the rain 10 weeks ago with two empty chairs beside her and a lullaby playing that she was not ready to hear. She was not the same person who had sat at table 11 trying to survive the bar talk. She didn't know exactly when that had changed. She thought it might have been the window, or the book, or the moment in the studio when she had pressed her hand against the side of his face and meant it in a way that committed her to something she hadn't fully understood the scope of yet. Because the scope of it turned out to include Sunday mornings and Brooklyn kitchens and 15 pages of emails that were about to detonate inside a boardroom full of people who had assumed that the woman in the green coat in the photograph was a complication they could route around. They had routed wrong. Holt pulled up to the Carver Grand side entrance, and she got out with the folder under her arm and went inside. She came through the office door with the folder and set it on the desk without ceremony. Roman looked at it and then at her. Harriet, who had returned from the 28th floor at some point in the previous hour, stood at the window with her coat still on. Nobody asked questions about Brooklyn. The folder was there. That was sufficient. Holt opened it and the room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when the thing everyone needed turns out to actually exist. He spent 40 minutes with it at the desk while Roman stood at the windows and Nora sat in the chair she had been in that morning, and nobody spoke because there was nothing to say that would be more useful than silence, while a lawyer read 15 pages of emails that were either enough or weren't. Holt finished the last page. He squared the papers against the desk surface with 2 precise taps and put them back in the folder and looked at Roman. "It's enough," he said. The words landed its room like something physical. Roman turned from the window. "All of it, or the core." The core is the authorization email from the Ashton office director to their finance department, copied to Stowane's private email address rather than his Voss board address. That single document establishes undisclosed compensation to a sitting board member from an interested external party. Under the company's governance bylaws, any vote influenced by an undisclosed conflict of interest is voidable. Holt's voice was even and precise, the voice of someone who had been waiting for a piece of paper like this for longer than he had said. The rest of the emails established the pattern and the timeline. But you could win the governance argument on the authorization email alone. "Friday's vote," Roman said. "If you table the documentation before the vote is called, Stowane has to recuse. Without Stowane, the favorable majority doesn't hold. The undecided members who are being managed by him will almost certainly abstain pending review, which effectively kills the proposal in the current session. And if they don't abstain, you table a formal challenge and the vote is suspended pending governance review, which takes 8 to 12 weeks, during which time the Ashton family is in a considerably more exposed position than they are today." Holt paused. "They won't want that exposure, not with these emails in play." Roman was quiet for a moment. He looked at Nora. She looked back at him. She wasn't going to say anything. This was his architecture and his decision. She had done the piece that was hers to do, and what came next was his. "Call Warren," he said to Holt. "Not tomorrow. Today." "He's not going to be pleased about a Sunday call." "No," Roman said. "He isn't." He picked up his jacket from the back of his chair and put it on, and the quality of him shifted slightly, the way it had in the lobby the morning after the wedding, when she had seen him in the space he actually owned, rather than the space she had mistakenly thought he was only managing. "Tell him we need a pre-meeting conference before Friday's session. 45 minutes. Tell him it's a governance matter that affects the validity of the vote." Holt picked up his phone and left the room. Roman and Nora were alone. He looked at her from across the desk. She looked at him. The morning light had moved across the floor while they had been in this room, and the office had the quality of a space that had absorbed several hours of compressed decision-making and was holding all of it in the air. "You went to a stranger's house," he said. "Yes, a stranger who could have called the Ashton lawyers the moment you left. She has been waiting 8 months for someone to take the folder," Nora said. "She was not going to call anyone. You couldn't have known that. I could read the room." She held his gaze. "That is what I do. I read things that aren't in the original language, and I find what they actually mean." She paused. She was ready. "I just had to show up." He came around the desk. He stopped in front of her, and she stood up from the chair, because she wasn't going to have this conversation from a seated position. They were close enough that she could see the exhaustion that had been accumulating in him for days, and possibly for much longer than that. "Thank you," he said, direct and undecorated the way he said everything that mattered. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "It's Sunday. Friday is still 5 days away." "4," he said. "4," she agreed. He put his hand along the side of her face and she let him, and she covered his hand with hers, and they stood there in the office above the city for a moment that was not romantic and not dramatic, but was simply necessary. Two people in the middle of something that wasn't finished, pressing into the only available stillness before it started moving again. Then his phone rang and the stillness ended. The next 4 days were the kind of days that leave marks. Holt reached Warren on Sunday afternoon, and the pre-meeting was set for Thursday evening at 6 in a conference room on the 25th floor of the Carver Grand, which was Roman's choice because neutral ground was not something he was willing to concede. Nora went back to Cambridge and translated for 3 hours and ate dinner and didn't sleep well, and came back to the hotel on Monday morning because there were things she needed to understand about what was happening, and she could understand them better in the building than outside of it. She was not a party to the legal work. She sat in the lobby with her laptop on Monday and Tuesday and translated and drank Walter's coffee, which was better than the hotel restaurants for reasons she didn't investigate. She watched the hotel operate around her. The luggage and the check-ins and the low piano music and the way every member of staff moved with the calibration of people who understood that the building was currently under a particular kind of pressure and were collectively deciding to be very good at their jobs in response. Walter sat with her for 20 minutes on Tuesday afternoon. He had brought her a second coffee without being asked, and then sat in the chair across from her work arrangement in the lobby corner with the ease of a man who had earned the right to sit where he chose. "He hasn't slept properly since Thursday," Walter said without preamble. "I know," she said. "He did this after his father died too. Runs on about 4 hours and doesn't show it until the 4th or 5th day, and then it starts showing in small ways." Walter looked at his coffee. His father was the same. Never let you see it coming. "How long did you know his father?" 22 years. A pause. "I was here when he built this lobby. He stood right there." Walter indicated a point near the center of the floor. "For about 20 minutes just looking at it when it was finished. Not saying anything, just looking." He picked up his coffee. Roman stood in the same spot the week after the funeral. Same amount of time. "I didn't tell him I had seen his father do it." Nora looked at the spot on the lobby floor. "Why not?" she said. "Because some things should belong to a person by themselves first," Walter said, "before they become a story." She thought about that for a long time after he went back to the desk. Wednesday brought the first outside pressure. A financial industry newsletter that covered hospitality sector mergers and acquisitions ran a piece referencing the Sunday article and framing the upcoming board vote as a crisis of leadership. Not the Ashton situation directly, but Roman's restructuring decisions positioned as the evidence of a president acting outside his mandate. 3 analysts downgraded the company's outlook. The stock moved 4 points. Roman called her at 7 on Wednesday morning. His voice was the 4th-day version Walter had described. Still controlled, but the edges of it showed the tension of something held very taut for very long. "The Ashton family's communications team put the newsletter piece out," he said. "It's their second move. They're trying to create a narrative about leadership instability before Thursday to affect Warren." She said Warren cares about the board's confidence in the president. If there's a public narrative about instability, he has less room to act independently on governance grounds. A pause. "They're smart." "So are you," she said. A silence. "I'm tired," he said. Not a complaint, a statement of fact delivered with the same directness he applied to everything. "I know," she said. 3 more days. Thursday evening. If Warren goes your way, Thursday evening, Friday is manageable." "You can't know that." "No," she said. "But I know that you have 15 pages of documented evidence and a governance argument that Holt says is airtight and a board chair who has been independent for 11 years. So I'm acting as though he will, because the alternative is spending 3 days catastrophizing instead of working." She paused. "Go sleep for 2 hours. I mean it." A sound that was almost a laugh. "You're very directive for a literary translator." "I translate people who wrote in 5 languages under authoritarian governments," she said. "I have developed a high tolerance for difficult situations." This time it was a laugh. Small and tired, but real. 2 hours, he said. 2 hours, she said. Thursday arrived gray and cold, the last cold day of what had been a cold spring. She walked the Esplanade at 7 in the morning because the walking helped and the river helped and because she needed to be outside of walls for an hour before she spent the rest of the day inside them. The pre-meeting was at 6. She was not going to be in it. She understood that without needing to have it explained. The pre-meeting was between Roman and Holt and Warren, and the documentation and her presence would complicate the framing of it. She was not a company person. She was the person in the photograph at the restaurant in Somerville, and that was a different kind of presence, and she knew the difference. She would be in the hotel, in the lobby, at the corner table. She told Roman this at 11 Thursday morning when he called to give her the final shape of what the evening looked like. He didn't argue. He said, "Walter will know where you are." "Walter always knows where everyone is," she said. "Yes," he said, "he does." The afternoon was the longest she had spent in recent memory. She translated without retaining what she had translated. She drank 3 cups of coffee and ate something from the hotel restaurant that Walter sent over without her asking. She answered an email from her publisher about the Ferentz introduction deadline and apologized for the delay and wrote 3 sentences of the introduction and stopped because the language was hiding from her, which happened sometimes when something else was using the part of her brain where language lived. At 5:50, the lobby had its early evening character. The day guests transitioning out, the dinner hour beginning to arrive, the light shifting from afternoon flat to the warmer gold of the chandelier hours. The piano was playing something modern and spare. At 5:55, Roman came through the lobby from the elevator bank. He was in the dark suit, the proper one, and he had slept. She could see it. The tautness she had heard on the phone Wednesday morning had resolved slightly. He stopped at her table and looked at her. "Warren's already up there," he said. "How does he seem?" "Like a man who read the emails and is angry about it and is carefully not showing that he's angry about it." He paused. "Which is the best version of Warren available?" "Good," she said. He looked at her for a moment. His hand moved and then didn't. A half gesture stopped. "Go," she said. He went. She sat in the lobby and listened to the piano and watched the evening arrive through the tall windows and did not translate anything for the next hour and 14 minutes. At 7:22, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Roman. It said, "Warren is calling an emergency governance review. The Friday vote is suspended pending investigation of the Stowain conflict. Holt says the Ashton family's counsel contacted him 6 minutes ago requesting a meeting." She read it twice. She set the phone down on the table. She looked at the lobby. The piano, the marble, the brass lamps throwing their warm circles on the floor, the luggage moving through the guests, and the quiet, systematic life of a building that had existed for 50 years and had absorbed 10,000 nights like this one, carrying them all in its walls. She picked the phone back up and typed, "Come down when you're done. I'll be here." She put it face up on the table and sat back and breathed, and the piano moved through its spare piece, and the lobby went about its Thursday evening business, and she waited. It arrived at 8:09. Not Roman, Everly Ashton. She came through the front entrance of the Carver Grand with the quality of a woman who had grown up entering rooms and had never once had a room fail to accommodate her. She was in a camel coat, blonde hair up. She was alone, which was notable because every mention of her had implied a person who moved with support structures around her. She was without them now, and the without them quality of her was different from the photographs. She was younger than the photographs. And there was something in her face that was not the composed socialite of the magazine insets, but something raw. Something that had happened to her today and hadn't been fully absorbed yet. She stopped 3 feet from Nora's table. "You're Nora Callahan," she said. "Yes," Nora said. Everly Ashton looked at her for a long, assessing moment. Her eyes were very blue, and they were doing what Roman's eyes did in rooms, taking inventory quickly and completely. "My family's lawyers called Roman Voss's counsel 20 minutes ago," she said. "I heard." Nora said nothing. Everly sat down in a chair across the table without being invited, which was not rudeness. It was the habit of a person who had never navigated the world via permission. "My father authorized the Stowain arrangement," she said. "I didn't know about it." Nora looked at her. "That's a significant thing to say to a stranger." "You're not a stranger," Everly said. "You're the reason the documentation exists in a place where it could be used." She looked at her hands on the table. "I know about Delia Marsh. I know what you did on Sunday." She paused. "My father is not a good man. I've been managing that knowledge my entire life. I did not know he had put a board member on a payroll to rig a merger vote, and I am." She stopped. The rawness in her face sharpened into something more precise. I am not going to be associated with it. Nora said nothing for a moment. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because in an hour, the Ashton family's public position is going to begin shifting, Everly said. And I want someone who isn't my family's lawyer to know that the shift isn't cover. It's real, she looked up from her hands. And because I wanted to look at you. Why? A pause that was complicated and very brief. Because I was told for 2 years that this merger was the logical conclusion of everything she said. And I believed it because I had no reason not to. And then someone with no leverage and no company affiliation and no personal benefit to gain went to a house in Brooklyn on a Sunday morning and sat down in a stranger's kitchen and found the piece of paper that changed what logical conclusion meant. She held Nora's gaze. I wanted to know what that person looked like. The piano had stopped. Somewhere in the hotel, a phone rang at the front desk and was answered on the second ring. What do I look like? Nora said. Everly Ashton almost smiled. It didn't quite make it out, but it was close. Like someone who doesn't know how unusual they are, she said. She stood up. She buttoned the single button on her coat. For what it's worth, she said, I hope it works out for him. I've met him 3 times in 2 years at formal events. He's always seemed like he was somewhere else. She looked toward the elevator bank briefly. He doesn't seem like that right now. She walked back out through the front entrance, and the door closed behind her, and the lobby resumed its Thursday evening life as if nothing had been interrupted. Nora sat very still. At 8:41, the elevator opened, and Roman and Holt came through the lobby. Holt was on his phone and peeled away toward the hotel restaurant without stopping. Roman came directly to her table and stood in front of it, and he looked like a man who had just spent 2 hours in a room where the thing he had been fighting for finally moved in the right direction, and the weight of that was still settling through him. He sat down. He looked at her. It's done, he said. Not yet, she said. Friday is procedural, he said. It's done. She looked at him across the table in the brass lamplight. The lobby was warm around them. Everly Ashton was here, she said. His expression registered. When? 20 minutes ago. She came to tell me she didn't know about the Stowain arrangement. Nora paused. I believed her. He was quiet for a moment, processing. She's going to cooperate with the governance review, he said. Her family's lawyers indicated as much. She may be. He stopped. She's different from her father. Yes, Nora said. She is. He looked at her. The thing that had been in his face during the half gesture at 5:55, the stop movement, was back now. But it wasn't stopped this time. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, where it rested on the surface, and held it there with the steady weight of a person who was very tired and very certain simultaneously. There's a board meeting tomorrow at 9, he said. I know, and then it's finished. Whatever the vote is, it's finished. I know, she said. He turned her hand over and held it palm up in his and looked at it for a moment the way he looked at things he was trying to understand. I would like there to be an after that, he said. There will be, she said. He looked up at her. The Ashton vote is going to fail tomorrow, she said. You're going to walk out of that meeting with the company intact and the restructuring complete, and Stowan removed, and 4 or 5 board members who are going to feel very uncomfortable about having been managed, which means they're going to vote with you on principle for the next 2 years out of injured pride. She watched his face. And then you are going to come down to this lobby, and we're going to sit in this exact spot and drink something that isn't hotel restaurant wine, because we're going to ask Walter where the actual bottle is kept. And you're going to tell me about your father standing in the middle of this floor looking at what he built. She paused. And I'm going to tell you about mine. His hand tightened slightly around hers. How do you know about that? He said. Walter, she said. Something moved through him. Not quite a laugh, and not quite the other thing. Something that occupied the space between them, warm and unguarded, and finally completely unpracticed. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she said. He didn't let go of her hand. Friday arrived without ceremony. No rain this time. No atmospheric assistance. Just a flat, colorless Boston morning in late May that hadn't decided yet what kind of day it intended to be. The sky a particular muted white that precedes either sunshine or nothing at all. Nora was awake at 5:40 without an alarm, which was her body's way of telling her it had processed the night and was prepared to face whatever came next, whether she was ready or not. She lay in the dark of the Cambridge studio for a few minutes. The space heater was off. The building was quiet. The street below had the hush of a Friday before 6, just the occasional car, just the pigeons starting up on the roof across the way. She thought about her father, Not about the lullaby, not about the empty chair, not about the 14 months of grief that had preceded the night she stood at a ballroom window in the rain. She thought about the way he used to sit at the kitchen table in Marblehead on the mornings before anything difficult and drink his coffee looking out the window with the stillness of a man who was neither avoiding what was coming nor rushing toward it, but simply occupying the space between. She had not understood that quality in him until she was 32 years old and sitting in the dark of her own apartment at 5:40 in the morning on the day of someone else's board meeting. She got up, she made coffee, she stood at her window the way he used to stand at his and looked at the Cambridge street and drank it slowly. At 6:15, she texted Roman, "Today is going to go the way it goes. You've done what you could do. Go in ready." His response came at 6:22. "I've been ready since Sunday." Then after a pause of about 40 seconds, "Thank you for last night." She didn't respond to that because there wasn't a response that was better than the silence it already had. She went to the hotel at 8. The board meeting was at 9 on the 31st floor. She was not going to the 31st floor. She was going to the lobby, the same corner, the same table. Walter had the coffee ready when she arrived at 8:12, which meant he had seen her come through the door and sent someone to the service area before she had crossed the lobby. She sat down and opened the Ference manuscript on her laptop because the introduction was due in 6 days, and she had 3 good sentences, and the rest of it was still somewhere below the surface of what the week had allowed her to reach. She worked. She worked badly, then adequately, then well enough that an hour passed without her checking the time. The introduction to the Ference was a problem she had been circling for 2 weeks. How to place a novel about bureaucratic violence in a context that American readers would feel without being condescended to. How to honor the quality of the dread in it without making it seem like a history lesson. She found the opening she needed at 9:47, which she knew because she looked at the time when it arrived, the way you look at the clock when something finishes. She wrote for another 20 minutes. At 10:19, she heard the elevator. She heard it because the lobby had a particular acoustic quality at this hour. The mid-morning lull between the breakfast rush and the lunch movement and the elevator's arrival was a clean sound in it. And then there were footsteps, and she knew them before she looked up because she had been hearing those footsteps on marble for 2 months and her body had cataloged the pattern without telling her. Roman came across the lobby. He was still in the board meeting suit, and he had been in a room for over an hour with 11 other people, and the documentation and Gerald Stone. And whatever that room had done to him in that time was visible in the way he carried himself now. Not broken, not diminished, but stripped. The management was off. The controlled surface was still present, but thinner like paper held up to light. And what showed through it was the actual person underneath. Exhausted, relieved, moving toward her with the directness that doesn't have performance in it. He sat down. He looked at the table for a moment. "Stowani resigned," he said. Before the vote, he came in with his personal attorney and resigned his board seat and left without speaking to anyone except the attorney. He looked up. The Ashton proposal was tabled pending governance review. 7 votes to 4. The 3 who voted to proceed were the Ashton family's longest financial relationships on the board. They'll be reviewed as part of the investigation. He paused. Warren called a full audit of board member external relationships going back 5 years. She looked at him. And the company, the restructuring holds. The financing dependency on the Ashton arrangement is effectively dissolved. He looked at his hands on the table. "We took a market hit this week. We'll take another one when the governance audit is announced. It will stabilize in 60 to 90 days. Holt says we're in better structural shape than before. The restructuring I completed is actually cleaner now that the Ashton dependency is out." "And Stowan," she said. "His legal exposure is significant," Roman said. "The Ashton family's too. Whether anyone pursues it criminally is not my decision, and I'm not going to make it my decision." He said it flatly and without apparent effort, which was how she knew it had cost him something. She said it quietly. "He was at the table when your father died." Roman looked at her. His jaw moved once. "Yes, I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be sorry for the right outcome." "But?" His voice had the roughness in it now, the thing that had been hiding under the tautness, and it was real. And she let it be there without covering it. They sat in the lobby for a moment, in the kind of quiet that isn't empty. "Walter," she said, "the bottle." He looked at her. "You said last night," she told him. "After the meeting, we were going to ask Walter where the actual bottle was." He looked at her for a long moment, And then he turned and found Walter at the concierge desk watching them with the expression of a man who had been observing this particular story develop from the beginning and was quietly satisfied with the chapter they appeared to have reached. Walter Roman called, "Sir, the Armagnac, the one my father kept." Walter opened a drawer and removed a key and held it up. "I'll get glasses," he said. The Armagnac came in the bottle that had been opened once and recorked and stored in a locked cabinet behind the concierge desk for 14 years, which was information Roman provided without being asked while Walter retrieved it. His voice level, like a man reciting something he had rehearsed in his own head many times and was finally saying aloud. His father had opened it the night the Carver Grand received its first International Hospitality Award in 2009. He had poured one glass each for himself and the senior staff and recorked it and told Walter to keep it for the next occasion worthy of it. He had died 11 months later. The bottle had waited. Walter poured 2 fingers into each glass with the care of someone who understood the weight of the pour. Then he withdrew, taking himself back to the desk in the natural way that made it seem as though he simply had somewhere else to be. Roman picked up his glass. He held it but didn't drink yet. Nora picked up hers. "You were going to tell me about your father," she said, standing here looking at what he built. Roman looked at the lobby. The marble, the brass, the chandelier turned low in the mid-morning, the piano unplayed at this hour, the doors through which 50 years of guests had passed. He stood in the center of the floor, Roman said. When it was finished, they had been renovating for 8 months, and there was a moment when the scaffolding was down, and the floors were clear, and the staff weren't in yet, and it was just him. He stood right there for about 20 minutes. He paused. I was 11. He had pulled me out of school for the day because he wanted me to see it. He didn't say anything the whole time, and then he looked at me and he said, "Your grandfather started with one room above a restaurant in Worcester. You remember that, one room." He looked at the spot on the floor. That was all he said. Then we went and got lunch. Nora looked at the spot. She held her glass in both hands. "My father," she said, "used to play the Bartok on Sunday mornings and then spend the afternoon writing comments on his students' theory exercises by hand. He had about 60 students every year, and he wrote individual comments for all of them. He did it for 30 years. She looked at her glass. "After he died, we found boxes in the attic. Every student had kept their comments. Some of them had written back. There were letters in there from students he had taught in the 80s and 90s. People who became music teachers themselves. People who hadn't gone into music at all, but wrote to tell him what the comments meant to them." She stopped. "He never told us about the letters. He just kept them." Roman was looking at her with the listening quality she had first seen at the ballroom window. The quality that made the person being listened to feel that every word was being received completely, rather than processed and cued. "He sounds like someone who understood that the things you do carefully outlast the things you do loudly," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly right." They drank. The Armagnac was very old and very good, and tasted like something that had been waiting patiently to be opened. The board's governance's audit was announced publicly on Monday morning. Nora read about it in the same financial newsletter that had run the leadership instability piece the previous Wednesday, which was using a noticeably different tone now that the terrain had shifted. She was in the studio with the Ference introduction open on her laptop, and she read the announcement over her morning coffee, and then she closed the tab and went back to the introduction. She finished it that afternoon. 6 days later, she received an email from her Czech publisher saying the translation had been selected as a finalist for a prize. She had submitted it for the previous fall and had not thought about since. She stared at the email for a while. Then she called her mother. Her mother cried a little in the way she cried about good news as well as bad, which was a quality Nora had spent most of her 20s finding excessive and now found exactly right. "Your father would have," her mother started. "I know," Nora said. "I know he would have. He always said you were the one who heard what was underneath the words," her mother said. Her voice warm and slightly exasperated in the way that implied she was surprised this was news. "He said you listened to what people were actually saying, not what they thought they were saying. He said it was a gift that not everyone understood was a gift." She sat with that for a long moment after they hung up. Then she called Roman. "I'm a finalist for the Kovac Prize," she said when he answered. A pause. "The translation prize." "Yes, Nora." His voice was warm and direct in the way it was about things he meant. "That's extraordinary." "I know," she said. "I wanted to tell you before I told anyone else." She heard him breathe on the other end of the line, just one breath, steady and full. "Come to the hotel tonight," he said. "Let's eat somewhere that isn't the restaurant. Walter knows a place. Walter knows everything, she said. He does, Roman said. 7 o'clock. The weeks after the board meeting had a different quality from the weeks before it. The pressure had come off in the way that sustained pressure comes off. Not all at once, not cleanly, but gradually, the way a sound fades at the edge of its range until one morning you realize you can't hear it anymore. The governance review moved forward with the methodical pace of institutional processes. 2 more board members with external relationships to the Ashton family disclosed and recused. Warren ran the review with the independence he had been appointed to provide, and which he apparently took seriously enough that Roman stopped worrying about the outcome by the 3rd week. The market stabilized in 47 days, which was ahead of Holt's projection. Roman stopped working past midnight on most nights, which Walter reported to Nora with a satisfaction he didn't bother concealing. Gerald Stone did not speak publicly. His attorney issued a statement that said very little and resolved nothing, and would presumably preface some larger resolution that was not yet arrived at. Nora thought about him sometimes. The eulogy he had given, the years of proximity to a family he had been simultaneously betraying. She thought about the ways people convinced themselves that the damage they were doing was contained, was manageable, was someone else's problem, right up until the folder was in someone's hands. Delia Marsh settled her wrongful termination case in July. Nora learned this from Holt, who called because she was on the record as the person Delia had chosen to give the documentation to, and who said the settlement terms were confidential, but that Delia had authorized him to tell Nora she was doing well. Nora wrote Delia a letter, a short one. She said thank you, and she meant it the same way Roman had meant it to her on the morning after Sunday, directly and without decoration, and in full knowledge that the word was insufficient, but was the right word anyway. Delia wrote back 2 sentences. You sat in my kitchen like you had nowhere else to be. That was the thing that made me open the drawer. Nora pinned the letter to the corkboard above her work table, between the translation prize nomination letter, and a photograph of her father at the piano in the Marblehead house, one she had found in a box of her mother's things in June, and had framed in a simple dark frame that suited him. The autumn launch event was Sylvie's idea. Sylvie had been watching her sister navigate the months since the wedding with the attentiveness of a younger sibling who had always been observing more than anyone knew. And when Nora mentioned in August that her Czech publisher was planning a small launch event for the translated novel, Sylvie said, without hesitation, the Carver Grand, not as a suggestion, as a statement. It should be there, Sylvie said. That's not neutral ground, Nora said. It's not supposed to be neutral ground, Sylvie said. It's supposed to be the right place. The mezzanine level of the Carver Grand was smaller than the ballroom, warmer, lower ceilings and better acoustics for intimate events, and a terrace that looked out over Back Bay in the amber light that October brought to the city. The publisher handled the logistics. The hotel handled everything else, which meant Walter handled everything else, which meant it was done correctly and without fuss and with attention to the details that mattered. Nora had translated 9 books over 11 years. She had been to events in small rooms in Cambridge and Chicago and Prague. She had stood at podiums and read from her translations and felt the familiar strangeness of speaking in her own voice the words she had rendered from another language, the words that were hers and also completely someone else's. This one felt different. She stood at the podium on the mezzanine of the Carver Grand on an October Friday evening with 60 people in the room, her mother in the front row, Sylvie beside her, her husband beside Sylvie. She read from the opening of the Ferenc novel the passage about the quality of light in a Budapest apartment in 1973, the passage she had struggled with for weeks and then found in a single sitting on a Sunday afternoon when the language had finally stopped hiding. She read it in Czech first for the 3 people in the room who could follow it. Then she read her English. When she finished, there was a silence before the applause, the kind of silence that means something was received. And then the applause, and she looked up from the page. Roman was at the back of the room, dark suit, and on his left wrist a watch she had seen him put on once in the office on a morning when he thought she wasn't watching. A watch that was old and had been serviced recently, the leather strap new, but the face original. The kind of object that had been restored rather than replaced. He had mentioned it in passing one evening in the hotel, that his father had stopped wearing it in his last years because the strap had worn through, and he had never gotten around to having it replaced, and Roman had found it in a desk drawer after the funeral and had kept it in the same drawer for 14 years because he hadn't been ready to wear it and hadn't been ready to put it away. He was wearing it now. He was watching her from the back of the room with the expression she had seen at the ballroom window and at the work table and in the lobby in the brass lamplight. Complete attention. And she looked at him for a moment across the room full of people. And then she looked back at her mother, who was smiling the way she smiled about good news fully and without restraint. The event ran for 2 hours. Wine conversation, a graduate student who asked her the most interesting question about translation ethics she had been asked in all year. She signed 12 copies of the novel. Harriet Voss arrived at 9:15 after the formal portion had concluded, and the room had shifted into the looser conversational afterglow. She came in quietly and did not approach Nora immediately. She stood near the terrace doors with a glass of wine and spoke with Nora's mother for several minutes, which Nora observed from across the room with the alertness of someone watching two strong personalities in proximity. She could tell from her mother's posture, the slight lean forward that meant genuine engagement, that the conversation was going well. Harriet came to her at 9:25. Charcoal again, the same severity, but something in it slightly different tonight, slightly less armored. The passage about the light in Budapest, she said. Yes, Nora said. I grew up in Warsaw, in an apartment with that exact quality of light. I hadn't thought about it in 30 years, she paused. You found something real in it. That's the only version of the job worth doing, Nora said. Harriet looked at her for a long moment. Then she opened the small bag she was carrying and took out an envelope and held it toward Nora. This is what I came to give you, she said. In addition to the other things. Nora took the envelope. It's a letter, Harriet said. I don't write them often and I don't write them well, but I owed you one. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, something had shifted in her voice, something that cost her to put into words. I have built things my entire life, she said. Companies, reputations, arrangements that were supposed to protect my son from exactly the kind of situation he spent the last 3 weeks in. She looked at her wine glass. None of it protected him the way you did, by going to Brooklyn, by sitting at a kitchen table with a stranger and being exactly what you are. She set the glass down. I don't have a word for what that is in English. In Polish, there is one, but it doesn't translate cleanly. She looked at Nora with the directness she applied to everything. That is the precise irony of asking a translator to accept an untranslatable thing. She paused. What I said in Cambridge about love and leverage, I want to correct that in writing because I said it in a way that was precise and wrong simultaneously, and I don't like leaving precise wrong things uncorrected. Harriet, Nora said. It requires no response, Harriet said. It's an apology. Those are one-directional. She glanced across the room to where Roman was talking with Sylvie and her husband, looking for the first time in Nora's observation of him in social situations, entirely like a person who was where he meant to be. He looks different, Harriet said. Not quite to Nora, to the air slightly beside her in the way you say things you have only just allowed yourself to see. Yes, Nora said. Good, Harriet said. And then she finished her wine and set the glass down and said good evening with the completeness she applied to all her exits and left the way she had come quietly without requiring anyone to accommodate her departure. Nora put the envelope in her coat pocket. She would read it later in the studio alone. Some things deserve the privacy of an unoccupied room. Some things you needed to receive without anyone watching your face while you did. The last guest left at 10:15. The hotel staff moved through the mezzanine with the efficient grace of people who had elevated the clearing of rooms to something close to art. Nora stood near the terrace doors in her coat and watched them work and let the evening settle around her. Her mother hugged her at the elevator, holding her a moment longer than the usual hug, the kind of length that means I am thinking about your father, which Nora received, and returned without words because they were past the point where words were necessary for that particular meaning. Sylvie hugged her last, fierce and brief. He's good, Sylvie said in her ear. Not a question. Yes, Nora said. Good, Sylvie said. They went. The mezzanine emptied. The staff finished their work and withdrew with professional invisibility. The lights were turned down to the low, warm setting the hotel used in its late hours. The chandeliers at half, the table lamps glowing. Nora stood alone in it for a moment. She looked at the podium, at the table with the remaining copies of the novel, at the terrace windows in the amber city beyond them, at the light that fell across the floor in the way that hotel light falls warm and encompassing, designed to make you feel that wherever you are is for this moment exactly where you should be. She thought about sitting at table 11 in this building 7 months ago, 2 empty chairs and a lullaby, and 30 minutes at a window that had changed the shape of everything that came after. She thought about all the translations she had done over 11 years, all the words she had carried from one language into another, all the things that had seemed untranslatable until she found the patience to hold them long enough for the right word to surface. She thought about how that work had prepared her without her knowing for things that had nothing to do with literature, for sitting in kitchens with strangers, for reading rooms, for finding what people were actually saying underneath what they thought they were saying, for staying at windows. Roman came in from the doorway at the far end of the mezzanine. He had been there long enough for her to have left if she had wanted to, and she hadn't wanted to. He crossed the room toward her with his jacket on and his father's watch on his wrist and stopped beside her near the terrace windows. They stood looking at the city for a moment. "Walter told me what you said to him," Roman said. "The week of the board meeting. He told me this afternoon." He paused. "He said you sat in the lobby every day that week and translated and drank his coffee." "His coffee is better than the restaurants," she said. "He makes it differently for people he respects," Roman said. "He has done it for 40 years. I only found out last year." She looked at him. "What does he do differently?" "The ratio," Roman said. "Some people get hotel coffee. Some people get a coffee." He paused. "He has been making me the second kind since I was 10 years old." She looked at Walter's desk visible through the mezzanine arch, where Walter was completing some final task with the methodical care he applied to everything. She felt a particular fondness for him, the feeling you have for people who were kind to someone you love before you arrive to be kind to them yourself. She went to the piano, the upright against the wall near the terrace, polished and present and unoccupied. It had been there all evening, decorative, untouched. She sat on the bench. She looked at the keys for a moment. She was not a pianist. She had been given lessons between the ages of 7 and 12 and had retained the basics and very little beyond them. She had not played for years. She put her hands on the keys. She found the Bartok. It came back the way things that are in your fingers come back. Not from memory exactly, but from somewhere below memory. From the part of you that learned something before you were old enough to decide whether to keep it. She played it slowly and imperfectly, some of the fingering wrong, some of the phrasing compressed because her hands didn't have the reach for the proper arrangement. But the melody was there, clean and recognizable and quiet in the warm mezzanine room. She heard Roman behind her, not moving, just present. She played it through to the end. Then she lifted her hands from the keys and the last note faded in the room, and the city was outside the windows and everything was very still. She felt him before she heard him, the warmth of his presence beside the piano bench, and then his hand on her shoulder, very light, the weight of a choice rather than a claim. She stood up. They were close enough that she could see what had been building in his face over 7 months, from the controlled attention of a stranger at a window to this. Something that was not performed and not managed and not the president of anything. Just a person. Just this particular, complicated, exhausted, careful person who had stayed when she expected him to leave and had given her a book she had wanted for 11 years and had made a decision 3 weeks in that had changed the shape of everything and had held her hand in a lobby and had drunk his father's Armagnac with her in the mid-morning light of a Friday that had cost them both things they would not get back. "Take me home," she said. He looked at her. Something in him settled, the final settling like a building finding its foundation. "Where is home tonight?" he said. She thought about the Cambridge studio and the Marblehead house and the Prague residency and the Budapest apartment with its particular light that she had translated into English on a Sunday afternoon when the language finally stopped hiding. She thought about table 11 and the 2 empty chairs and everything she had been carrying alone for so long that the weight of it had started to feel like her own body. "Wherever we stop carrying everything alone," she said. He put his hand against the side of her face and she leaned into it, and they stood there in the quiet mezzanine of the Carver Grand while the city held its amber light outside and Walter kept his watch at the desk below, and the building settled around them the way old buildings settle, full of everything they had absorbed. Then they walked out together into the October night, not rescued, not healed in any clean or complete way, not transformed into something simpler than what they had been. Still carrying the fathers who had left too soon, and the years spent managing what should have been shared, and the scar tissue of people who learned to survive before they learned to stay. But changed in the real way, the irreversible way, the way that doesn't look dramatic from the outside, because it happens in kitchens and lobbies and at windows in the rain. In the small calibrations of two people who kept choosing toward each other when the easier choice was available. The street received them without ceremony. The city had no record of any of it. It held its noise and its light and its 10,000 simultaneous lives and moved on the way cities do, without acknowledgement or ceremony. Nora Callahan walked through it beside a man she had not known 7 months ago and felt the autumn air on her face and the letter in her coat pocket and the ghost of the bar talk in her hands. And none of the ghosts were gone. She knew they were not the kind of things that went, but they were lighter now in the way that things become lighter when you are no longer carrying them entirely alone. Behind them, the Carver Grand held its ground on the Back Bay Street with its gold lights and its marble and its doors that opened before anyone spoke. The way it had held its ground for 50 years through everything that families do to each other and for each other and despite each other. Inside, Walter Ames locked the last cabinet and turned off the desk lamp and put on his coat and looked at the lobby once in the quiet way he looked at it at the end of every night. The floor, the lamps, the piano, the empty chairs arranged for tomorrow's guests. Then he went home. The lobby held the silence. The lamps burned low, and the building which had seen everything held all of it. The grief and the music and the 15 pages in a folder and the Armagnac opened after 14 years, and the sound of someone playing an imperfect lullaby on an upright piano on a Friday night in October. Held all of it in its walls the way good buildings hold things, without asking what it cost, without keeping a record of the debt, just holding, just keeping the lights on.